Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Mark Borstein. I'm the CTO of Tremolo Security and co-author of Kubernetes and Enterprise Guide Second Edition. We've taken a few weeks off, making some other great content, but we're back in action today. We are going to talk about Chapter 6, RBAC. This is, to me, a fascinating topic because one is deceptively difficult. It's just string comparison at the end of the day. It's really like that simple, yet it is got to be the hardest thing to do correctly. Um, it's difficult to debug because of the way Kubernetes does it. And so it's one of those things that should be simple, seems like it should be simple, but is deceptively difficult. And so chapter 6 is kind of an interesting chapter because it's one of the drier chapters. We walk through how to make roles, how to make bindings, um, and then we also talk a bit about things like negative roles. Why in Kubernetes can you not say I want to give access to everything except? And there's some really good reasons for that. And we go through that in this chapter. And we also talk about aggregate roles. So you're on an interview and you really want to impress your interviewer. I'm telling you, you bring up aggregate roles and that aggregate roles, you're good. That'll probably be it. Um, and so we kind of talk a little bit about roles versus cluster roles. Like I said, negative roles. I'm just kind of going through here till we get to the labs. Um, Bindings, how you bring that together. And then we get to mapping enterprise identities to Kubernetes to authorize access to resources. So I'm on page 219 at this point. And that's when we really start getting into the labs. In the previous chapter, in chapter 5, we created a cluster role binding so that we could get access, but we didn't really talk about what that was. And why that worked. So, by the time you've gotten to this point, you can actually see what's going on. Now, one of the things that this section points out that's a really important best practice is to not use names directly, user identities directly in your RBAC bindings. Chances are you've gone through, you've created an identity provider, you've created this OpenID Connect connection. You don't want to start using users directly in RBAC bindings for a couple of reasons. One, unless you're using your email address, which I really hope you're not using the email claim. We talked about why in the previous chapter, but names change. You don't want that to change. You don't want to, you have to include your identity provider URL. So if you need to change the URL of your identity provider, you got to go back and redo all of your RBAC bindings. That's really painful. And then two, when you're doing groups, you want to use groups in your RBAC bindings, and we'll see how that kind of comes together. But then, your RBAC bindings just become so much simpler. RBAC's hard enough. Don't make your life harder by trying to update these RBAC bindings individually. Do it in your identity provider. And then we talk about a little bit about namespace multi-tenancy. Now, we're really going to get in the weeds on this in chapter 14 when we get to building a platform. But we talk about, the different types of multi-tenancy and, some of the benefits there. And then finally, we get into Kubernetes auditing. This is really where the rubber hits the road because you want to know who's doing what inside of your cluster. And then finally, we get to page 224 and enabling auditing on a cluster. So that's where we're going to get started, get into this lab. Excuse me. So what I have here so far is I have a a empty kind cluster. Start with a fresh cluster on each chapter. Make your life much easier. You don't have to deal with, whatever you're dealing with in the last chapter. Kube control get nodes. I've got a cluster here. For some reason, this VM's running a little slow today. See, there it is. Kube control get namespace. Pretty empty cluster. we're getting started from scratch here. So now the first thing we need to do is we need to have an identity provider. We need to deploy Open Unison. We're not going to ask you to go back and redeploy everything. That would be kind of painful. And so what we've done is we've actually given you a script in the Open Unison that is going to just deploy Open Unison for you. So you're going to go from 0 to having an Open Unison that works in impersonation mode like that. Well, not quite like that, but you're not going to have to redeploy everything from scratch the way we did in Chapter 5. So I'm going to go ahead and run that. And it's a little late for me to grab a cup of coffee, but if you are open to drinking coffee, whatever time it is where you are, now would be a good time because this is going to probably take a few minutes. So you will see us spin around and we'll be back when this is done. All right. And Open Unison is deployed. Let's see if it's completely deployed. We'll get pods and Open Unison. And okay, we're just waiting for that last pod to deploy. There we go. Everything's ready. So we should be able to log in. HTTPS k2u.apps. Actually, don't think we have apps on this. I can double check. All right, so far so good, and no, maybe it does have apps. Hey, winner, winner, chicken dinner. All right, can I log in? I can. Now let's check here. Can I go to the dashboard? Cool, cool. I'm logged in as Matt Mosley into the dashboard. And finally, let's go ahead and check out my tokens. Now, I've got this set up to work with impersonation. So if I go to another host, let's go ahead and get rid of our kube config. Okay, get net, or nope, I should probably nodes, nothing works. Kube control, get nodes. Beautiful. Okay, cool. So now we can access our cluster from away from the cluster, so that's helpful. So okay, cool. So we now have a working Open Unison. Next, we are going to set up the API server to send the audit log data to a file. So I'm back on no, I want to go back here. So I am now on step number 1 on page 225. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this command and of course audit. Okay. So what this did was this created the audit directory inside of our control plane container. So remember, kind, Russian dolls. So kind is a Kubernetes cluster that's running inside of Docker containers. So you've got containers inside of containers. And so our control plane container runs our control plane. And so we need to set up that control plane container in order to accept the logs. So the first thing we did was we created the logs. Next thing we need to do is we need to copy, I'm in the right place, right? Yes, our audit log policy. Now we're not going to get into the details of the policy because there are a lot of potential details. So what we did was we put together kind of a good starting point. That'll get you most of the log data and that'll tell you what changes are happening and also give you enough data so that when RBAC doesn't work, you can reverse engineer what you're trying to accomplish. So we're copying that audit policy into Kubernetes, into our control plane cluster. So now the next thing we need to do is we need to enter our control plane, exec ti Oh, that's right. I'm not dealing with Kubernetes here. All right. And we are going to need a text editor so we can do a little work. So I'm going to go ahead and kick this off. And if you need a cup of coffee, now's a good time because it takes a long time to install Vim into a container. All right, so we have Vim. So let's go ahead and I'm on step 3. Etsy, Kubernetes, manifests, Kube API server. So kind is Kubernetes and Docker, but under the hood, kind is just kubeadm, which is not surprising because a lot of commercial distros actually do that, where they're just wrapping kubeadm inside of their own management systems. And so what we need to do is this would be the same as if you had a kubeadm cluster. And so kubeadm runs your API server inside of a pod. It's static pod. So it's not a, there's no deployment that you can edit. And so, you know, turtles all the way down. And so we've got a few edits that we need to make. So the first thing we need to do is after our private key, we need to tell the API server, let's turn on logging. And we're going to do that. Can I just copy and paste this without ruining my day? See what happens. Not terrible. So we're going to add a bunch of parameters to the API server. Now, if you are running a distro other than kind, or excuse me, other than kubeadm, what you're going to want to do is check with your cluster's documentation. This is one of those things that because it's an API server configuration, much like when we set up OpenID Connect in the last chapter, whether or not your cluster supports it will depend on whether or not you can change these parameters. Now, that said, pretty much every cloud managed Kubernetes has a way of tracking audit information, usually native to the cloud. So you're going to want to use that. So we've done that, but don't quit yet. We still have more work to do because even though we've defined where our policy is coming from, remember, this is a container. So imagine that our control plane Docker image is actually a server, is actually a VM. The API server is a container, so we have to mount all of our external volumes onto that container. So we defined a new, where the data is going here, this var log Kates. Well, guess what? We need to define that on our server, which we did earlier, but now we need to mount it into our pod so our pod can write to it. Same thing here with the policy file, this kate.policy.yaml. Again, because it's a container, it actually has to read that off of the host, so we have to mount it as a volume. So that's next. Let's go ahead and find, I'm on step 6 now. So we're looking for mount paths, which is here. So now let's go ahead and put in our mount paths. I suspect this is going to jack up all of the indent, and I was right. Not a big deal. All right, so the mount path and read only. So we're defining now mount paths inside of our container. We're saying, hey, inside of our container, we are going to have these mount paths for Etsy Kubernetes audit, where we're pulling the config from, and var log Kates. Now, just like any other pod, the next thing we need to do is we need to define where it's going to come from. So we've defined inside of our container, these are volume mounts. Now we actually have to associate that with a volume. And so we're going to use host path to be able to define that. So I got to change this to select. Oops, what'd I do? What'd I do? What'd I do? Oh, I was working on Linux all day. Whoa! I was working on Linux all day today, and my keyboard shortcut muscle memory is all kinds of off. So please forgive me. All right, let's fix our indenting. So we've defined inside of our container what volumes we need. And now we're linking those to host paths. So now the API server, now check the indenting because YAML. And this is usually where people get the most messed up is because there was a lot of editing here. So we're going to go ahead and save it. And that was step 8. So now let's see if we can't see if we're running again. Kube system. Yeah, if you're playing along at home, it's strange. I will actually find that running kube control locally on my Ubuntu all-in-one server here running Kind will actually be slower than impersonation. But hey, there we go, 28 seconds, so we're good to go. So now let's go ahead and see if we got some data. And the good news is we will. So audit.log. So we're going to tail, this is the path that we gave it. We gave our API server. This is where we want our logs to go. So what do we got? I'm still logged into Docker. That's why. So now, oops, there we go. Let's try this once more. There we go. Look at that. We've got all sorts of stuff in here. Now, I'm not going to dive too deeply into this other than to say, cool, we have an audit log. And so there is a lot in here. And as we say in the chapter, once we get to chapter 10, when we start talking about Falco, I'll be honest, that's one I'm really excited about because I don't get to work with Falco as much as I'd like. We're really going to get into that. So now that we have an audit log, what are we going to do with it? Well, one of the things you're going to want to do is pipe this into a log aggregator so you have someplace to keep an eye on it. But the other great thing you can do with this data is reverse engineer your audit logs, or excuse me, your RBAC policies. One of the things that gets really tricky with RBAC is the error message that you get back when you can't do something, isn't always going to give you all the information you need, or at least you often have to get really good at reading those error messages to get all that information. That said, fine fellow named Jordan Leggett, who is one of the main forces behind SIGAuth, which is the group of very fine individuals who write all of the identity related stuff when it comes to Kubernetes. Really great team. Amazing at answering questions. So please, I beg you, if you have questions, join the SIGAuth channel on Kubernetes Slack. They will answer your questions. Lord knows they've answered all of mine over the years. So Jordan Leggett wrote this great tool called Audit to RBAC, which takes audit logs and reverse engineers them into RBAC policies. And so I know it's a mainstay for me. It's one of the first things I go to, especially as I was learning how Kubernetes worked. So I am now on page 228. So we are going to go ahead, and the first thing we're going to do is log in with the user Jay Jackson. So I'm actually going to switch contexts here. Do I still have a... Okay, so I'm right now logged in as M. Mosley. I don't want to be, so let's close this out. And let's completely log out. And let's go ahead And we're going to log in as J Jackson. So J Jackson has a different set of roles. So we're a member of this CN equals K create namespace group, but we are not a member of the administrator group. So I'm actually going to log back in as M. Mosley here real quick, just to show you. Nothing up my sleeves. So Matt here was a member of this Kate's cluster admin group. So if you remember back from chapter 5, we created an RBAC binding on that group that said, you know what, if you're a member of that group, you're a cluster administrator. Our friend Jackson, to be honest, I don't remember if it's Mr. Jackson or Ms. Jackson. Not now. Does not have that admin permission. So if we go over here, we try to log in, we're going to see lots of errors that J Jackson doesn't have access to anything, which is great. So let's go ahead, grab a new token, and let's come back here. This should be expired by now. I love my software. All right, so I'm logged in, and I'm going to get nodes. And it will fail. It is forbidden. Now let's take a look at this error message real quick. User J Jackson, okay, cannot list resources nodes in API group. So in theory, this is enough information that we could build an RBAC policy off of, a role or a cluster role. But you know, this is kind of hard to parse, especially the API group. The empty API group is actually core, so it's you know it's navigable, but it's a little painful. So what we're going to do though is we're going to get rid of this error message. So right now I'm on page 228, step 6. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a binding. So I'm going to be lazy because, you know, they say the best developers are lazy, right? RBAC.yaml. All right, so let's go ahead and copy this. Oops. And this is going to not do that correctly, so that's right, and this rolls up. All right, so what are we doing here? So we're defining a cluster role called cluster create namespace. It is a cluster role, so apply to, so cluster roles can either be permissions that apply at a cluster level, so namespaces are cluster objects, nodes, well, cluster roles, but any cluster level object, or cluster role can also be a namespace level object. And so that becomes really helpful. For instance, when you're talking about multi-tenancy, you define one cluster role, and then you use a role binding to apply that into each namespace. So that way, if you need to change the permissions attached to the role or the cluster role, you only change it once. So let's go ahead and save this. And I did exactly what I shouldn't have done. Let's actually come back here where I do have permissions. Because if I had tried that with the other one, I don't have permissions to do that. And like I said, for some reason, sometimes, there we go. All right, so temp RBAC, because again, I am lazy. All right, let's go ahead and create it. So I created the role binding, or the cluster role, excuse me, I created the cluster role. So now we need to authorize somebody to use it. So we're going to create a cluster role binding. And let's go ahead and let's fix our So we're defining a user here called Jay Jackson. Now you'll notice that the name doesn't have the IDP appended on it. That is because we're using impersonation right now in this cluster. We didn't actually set up OpenID Connect. And in OpenID Connect is not, or impersonation doesn't have the same rules as OpenID Connect. With impersonation, you don't have to have the identity provider because there is no identity provider. And so you can reference users directly. That said, don't do it. This is just an example. Make your life easy. Don't reference users directly. Still an anti-pattern. So what are we doing here? We are creating a cluster role binding that applies to the user Jay Jackson and references the cluster role we just created. So now let's go ahead and create that. All right, so now that that's been created, we can go ahead and we can try running kube control create namespace. Not going to work, but it is going to work. Ta-da! We can create namespaces now. And so that is through the beauty of RBAC. So, you know, when you get really good at RBAC, you'll be able to write these rules. Not easily, but you'll get a good feel for it. That said, like I said before, this is usually not how you start. You know, I know, and I've been doing this since like RBAC came out in 1.3, maybe it was 1.4, and it takes a long time to get good at this. And so, going back to Jordan Liggett's tool, Audit to RBAC, let's go ahead and get that working. So what I am going to do is I'm going to cheat. I love cheating. I love being lazy. I'm not going to lie. All right. So, oops. All right. So let's go ahead and pull it down. And then let's untarball it. Oh, I'm on the wrong one again, aren't I? Shoot. All right. You do need to be wherever your system is. So we're going to go ahead and do this. All right. Tar xvzf audit to RBAC. Not in let's double check something here. Oh, looks like Jordan moved it. All right, so let's go ahead and grab the latest. Oh, looks like we're going to have an errata here. Ah, because he came out 0.9. That's why. You tricky devil. Okay. So which one do we need? We need Linux AMD 64. Linux AMD 64. All right, so let's copy the link. I think I can just do wget. Hey, here we go. All right, and then audit to RBAC 1. Okay, cool. So now we have the audit to RBAC command. All right, so now I am on step 2 on page 230. And what I'm going to do is, first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to delete temp. Kube control delete F. That's what happens when you let your certifications expire. You just forget how to do everything. Okay, so if we come back here, And let's make sure kube control create namespace still not going to work. Didn't work, right? Not allowed to create namespace. All right, so now let's come over here to audit to RBAC. And let's go ahead and call audit to RBAC. File name. Oh, we gotta go to the control plane. Docker exec. I wasn't paying attention. TI. I gotta log into my control plane to pull this in. Docker PS, Docker exec TI, and that's my control plane, bash. Okay. Now what we're going to do is we're going to do curl L, and we want Linux AMD 64, copy link. Into dev null. And we're going to do that to this. All right. tar xvzf. Okay. Now we are over here. So next thing we're going to do is run our audit to RBAC tool. So this is our var log Kate's audit.log, and we want to look for user equals J Jackson. So what we're saying is go look for all things that failed for our user J Jackson in that log. And well, shoot. User J Jackson. That's interesting. All right, let's see what's going on here. Var log Kate's. I'm on the control plane. Oh. Kate's. See what's going on here. All right. Sometimes what happens is, let's see if that's it. There we go. Okay. So what happens is this log gets so big. There we go. Okay. So the log, what happened was the log got so big it rotated right after I ran that test, which is why it didn't appear to work. It did work. It's just it had already been rotated. So sometimes you got to be a little quick on the draw. So that said, let's see what got generated here. We have a cluster role, and that cluster role is pretty close to what we created, right? Namespaces create names a little bit different, and we've got a couple of labels and annotations here to help identify it, but that's about it. And then here we have a cluster role binding that again, matches directly with our user. So now we can go ahead and let's take this and let's exit out gen.rbac.yaml. And let's go ahead and create it. Kube control create f temp gen RBAC YAML. Boom. Okay, that's done. So now let's try creating it again. And it worked. So we now were able to use that audit log to reverse engineer what the problem was so we could now create that RBAC binding. Really super valuable. I cannot recommend this tool enough. This tool has saved me hours of work of just staring and going, this should work. This gives you actually something actionable to work on. And okay, so we created that. And so in step 4, we're now saying, you know what, it would be better if we used our group. So, you know, what's not unusual is that you say, all right, I use this tool to get started, but, you know, like we said, we don't actually want to use users, right? We want to use groups. And so let's go ahead. I'm on step 4 on page 231, and we're going to assign our group. So if we come back here and we look at our user, that's the group we're a member of. That lines up. And let's go ahead and apply that. So that's been applied, and now we should still be able to create that namespace. And oh, whoops. Mark, you and your security. All right. Let's log in. Go ahead, grab a new token. Now let's try and create, and it still worked. Why? Because our RBAC binding now maps to our group instead of directly to our user. All right, so that brings us to the end of chapter 6. Read through this chapter a couple of times. It's kind of dry because a lot of it's reference material. We do apply it to real world scenarios, but again, it's really dry. I get it. Go through, make sure to do this exercise. It will really help. You know, the key to remember about RBAC is it's all strings. It's all string matching. And it has to be case sensitive. So if the strings don't match, even if it's capital A versus lowercase a, it's not going to work. It's not going to normalize against anything. So like we're using distinguished names. Well, that can actually be a little dangerous at times because if you copy things incorrectly or you have spaces, even though that would normalize correctly, RBAC does not care. RBAC is a honey badger. So it has to match exactly. So that said, thanks so much for joining us on Chapter 6. We will be back next week with one of my favorite topics, the Kubernetes dashboard and the security of the dashboard. We're going to talk about that. It's really one of my favorite topics. And yeah, so my name is Mark Borstein. If you like, please hit that like or subscribe button, or should I say smash it? Just not too hard. I don't want you to break the keyboard. And thanks for joining.